The courthouse leaned like a tired mule. Stove heat had baked the walls pale and the windows sweated grime. A ceiling fan clicked with a lazy, useless rhythm. Willa Hart stood at the center of it all with her father's ledger crushed to her ribs, the paper damp where her fingers had held too long. She smelled iron from her own palms. She had scrubbed all morning and still could not wash the dirt out of the creases. Judge Amos Pritchard adjusted his spectacles with 2 fingers slow and careful. His gavel sat near his hand as if it had grown there. Men along the wall tipped chairs on 2 legs, boots up, eyes down. The clerk coughed into a rag and folded it twice. Dust lifted when anyone moved, then fell like old snow. The court recognizes improvement, the judge said. His voice had the weight of gravel. The court does not recognize sentiment. Without deed, Hart's Draw is vacant land. Vacant land annexes to the closest surveyed holding, Hale Range. The single rap of the gavel felt heavier than just wood on wood. It felt like a latch locking. Someone near the back sucked air through his teeth. Someone else muttered about how long the Harts had held that draw, how the pear trees grew better there. Willa did not look at them. She looked at the knot on the judge's tie because it was something real to focus on. Then she turned and walked out, ledger tight to her body boots, quiet for a girl who had learned to move around sleeping men. Outside, Ash Bluff leaned into the wind. False fronts on stores made promises they never kept. A team clinked past with milk cans rattling. Cigarette smoke hung near the door of the lariat like a curtain. Willa untied her mare with a slip knot, the kind you use when you might have to leave fast. The knot came loose like it wanted to help. She rode without speaking. The land unrolled in brown and gold. Hawk shadow skimmed the wheat stubble and was gone. When the gates of Hale Range rose up iron black against a red sky, she felt her teeth find each other. The last of the sun was a copper coin pressed low against the ridgeline. A man stood in the yard with his hat low and his sleeves pushed to his elbows. Cassius Hale set a cartridge on his thumb and slid it into the carbine with a patient, exact motion. Oil smell hung in the air. His knuckles were scraped like he had been adjusting fence staples. He did not look surprised when she rode in. He looked like a man who had known for hours the wind would shift. "You going to ask me for your land back?" he said. It was not a question he needed answered. Willa swung down the dust, lifting around her skirt, then settling on the leather like flour. "Do not take my home." Silence sat between them. A dog barked twice far off and quit. Cass put the rifle aside and rested both hands on the top rail as if it were a desk between them. "The only way for that draw to bear your name is if it belongs to my wife." It landed soft and heavy. Willa's throat tightened without show. "I am not a trade," she said. "I am not a hinge on your borders. I'm not asking for a hymn. I'm asking for a fact. You want to stay. The deed goes to my family. You would be my family." She looked past him to the slope that held the first pear tree her father had planted. A child's hand had once gripped that sapling to steady it in spring wind. She could still feel the give of thin bark under a small palm. "If I agree," she said, "I live on that draw. I plant it. I decide who walks the rows. I am me." His eyes were the flat blue you see in the shadow side of ice. No arguments there. "You put it in writing," she said, "my name, not as dependent, as steward." "Done," he said. He did not say more. He did not reach for her hand. He did not step close at all. A gust ran through the yard and tilted the hat on his head. Willa watched him set it right with 2 fingers. He had careful hands. She had seen careful hands break things when they moved too fast. He did not move fast now. "My well runs brackish by July," she said. It came out like a test and like a confession. Tastes of nails. He nodded once like he had put it in a column to reckon later. "I will come in the morning," he said. "Mayor's office. Mayor Sutton likes papers more than prayers." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She hooked her boot into the stirrup and swung up. He stepped back not out of fear, but because the horse had earned its space. He touched 2 fingers to his hat brim. She turned the mare and rode out through the gate as the last of the light drained to iron. Night came brown and cold. Willa stabled the mare in the lean-to at Hart's Draw and laid a palm on the animal's neck until both of them stopped shaking. She hung her father's ledger from a peg by the door as if placing it on an altar. The cabin knew her weight in its floorboards. It knew how she turned a cup in her hand once before she drank. She set a kettle on the small iron stove and waited, listening to it think about boiling. In the quiet, the wind pushed at the plank seams and a pear rolled in a bowl and tapped twice. She crossed the room and picked it up, thumb feeling the bruise she had not seen. She cut the bruise away with a small knife, the blade bright and honest. She ate standing, eyes on the door. When she finished, she set the knife down with care and knotted her shawl tighter under her chin. It was late. She pulled the head rope on the stall and retied it with a slower knot, not the quick kind, but something meant to hold if a thing pulled against it. The rope rasped against itself and left a smear of dust on her fingers. She wiped them on her skirt and looked down at the faint mark. It made her think of signatures. The moon rose round and thin above the black line of the ridge. She lay on her pallet with her boots by the door and her coat for a blanket. She did not sleep. She kept hearing the gavel. She kept hearing Cass Hale say "my wife" like it was a step he was willing to stand on, but not a flag he was trying to wave. At first light, the frost lay in a brittle skin over the trough. Willa broke it with a stick and watched the shards drift and sink. She washed her face in the water that had not seen sun yet. It smelled like tin and ground. When she walked across the yard, the boards under her feet creaked on the same notes they always did. She paused at her own threshold and looked back inside. The chair, the stove, the peg with the ledger. She closed the door and set the latch. Mayor Sutton's office sat above the feed store. A bell on the downstairs door clattered, and a boy swore softly when he dropped a sack of oats. Willa climbed the stairs and found the office bright with winter light and cold as a church. Mayor Sutton had a clean vest and a warm smile he wore like he wore his watch chain. A deputy sat with his hat on his knee. The mayor set a single sheet in the center of the desk and smoothed it with both hands. Cass Hale stood near the window with his back to the room. He had combed his hair. The part was too straight for comfort. He did not turn until Willa stopped. He took in her shawl the frost on the hem. He stepped to one side so she would not have to walk near him if she did not want to. She did not look at him. She looked at the pen. Mayor Sutton cleared his throat as if he might deliver a speech. Then he thought better and did not. "Names go here," he said softer than the room seemed to require. Willa set her ledger on the edge of the desk and opened it to the page where her father had once drawn fence lines by candle. She put her finger on the corner like it was the weight that would keep her steady. Cass stood as if the floor had asked him to be still. No one touched the threshold of anyone else. The pen lay in its little glass rest. Light slid along its barrel. The nib looked sharp enough to cut rope. Willa reached out. Her fingers hovered over the wood. The room held its breath. The bell downstairs rattled once, then went quiet. Willa drew a breath that tasted of ink and cold, and the faintest hint of her father's pipe from the ledger pages. She lifted the pen. She did not lower it yet. The pen point touched down. Ink slid like a vein opening. Willa wrote her name slow enough to feel each letter catch and resolve. Mayor Sutton tipped his head as if the sun through the window had just pleased him. The deputy made a small mark of his own and tried not to stare. Cass stepped forward only when she stepped back. He signed where the mayor tapped. The ring on the mayor's finger clicked against the glass inkwell when he set the pen down. Papers stacked, then separated again. "There is a supplemental," Cass said. His voice had a gravel calm. He nodded toward a thinner sheet the mayor drew from an envelope. "Recognition of stewardship. Name as steward, not dependent. Bound to that parcel." Mayor Sutton read the first lines under his breath, then slid the page to Willa. The words were plain. Hart's draw described to the tree and the creek bend. Steward named Willa Hart. Right to plant, right to bar entry, right to decide water and fence. Repairs listed in a neat hand. Roof stovepipe well depth to clean water. Hale range to provide materials and labor as needed until the steward declines. Willa traced the margin with a fingernail and watched the tiny shine the nail left behind fade to dull. "You wrote the repairs," she said without looking at him. "I did." "Who told you what needed fixing?" "You did. Last night." He said it like the sky had said it, like it would have been foolish not to listen. Mayor Sutton cleared his throat again. He did not try a speech this time either. "Sign here," he said. Willa picked up the pen. When she set the last curve of her name, she felt the nib scratch a little like a match that does not quite catch. She blew on the ink once and set the pen down. The deputy stood and shook Cass's hand. Then hers looks careful, not sure what belonged to congratulations. They did not talk about flowers or rings. They spoke about the boundaries line by line. On the stairs, the feed boy missed a step and swore softly again. The bell clattered. Willa gathered her ledger and tucked the steward paper inside it like a pressed leaf. Outside, the air had teeth. She walked with the paper tucked close to her ribs. Her breath came white and loud. Cass walked behind her a pace and a half, not to shadow, but because the sidewalk was narrow and men were carrying a crate. At the bottom of the steps, he stopped. "You want me to ride with you?" he asked. It was quiet. The wind in the eaves did most of the talking. "I know the way," she said. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not walk her to her horse. He waited until she mounted and then touched 2 fingers to his hat brim again. When she turned in the saddle, he was not there to watch her go. He had gone back inside to file whatever needed filing. By the time she reached Hart's Draw, the frost had burned off the grass. Water sat flat and dark in the basin by the door, a thin rind of ice still clinging to the shadowed side. Willa opened the cabin and set the ledger on its peg again with the new page inside where the old candle soot had once stained the paper. A man with a mule came into the yard near noon. He had a box of tools slung on a strap and a hat that had seen better weather. He stood at the step without putting a boot on it. "Morning, ma'am," he said, polite and tired. "Name's Deke. Mr. Hale sent me. Said your stovepipe needs a straight piece and the roof near the eave is soft." "I did not ask for help," Willa said. Deke shifted his jaw and scratched at the strap. He said it was in the paper. It was. The words had sat there in honest print. Willa looked up at the roof and saw the places where it lifted in a curl and let the sky in when the wind hit right. "You can fix where the rain gets through," she said. "Nothing else." "Nothing else," Deke said, relief rolling through his shoulders. He drank from his canteen and spit on the dust and then got to it. Willa kept to the ground. She hauled wood from the lean-to and stacked it by the door. She checked the garden bed at the east wall, where the sun hit first, and pressed a knuckle into the soil to see how it held shape. She did not offer Deke water. When his mule snorted like a kettle, she went inside and filled a dipper and set it on the step without a word. Deke drank and tipped his hat. He kept his boots off the threshold. He knew a line when he saw it. Near evening, after Deke had gone with his tools in a different order than they had come, a dog dragged itself out of the brush and collapsed on the lee side of the cabin. Cinder had a coat the color of old rope and a right ear bitten jagged long ago. He did not whine. He watched Willa with the eyes of a thing that had learned to wait a very long time. She dropped a heel of cornbread from the table and pretended she had dropped it by accident. He took it in 2 bites and then put his head down on his paws and did not move, as if moving might cost him the food. "You can stay under the eave," she said finally. Cinder did not thump his tail at the sound of his new name. He just stayed. In the morning, she woke to a soft grind of iron on iron that was not from her place. She pulled on her boots and went outside. Cass Hale stood at the well with his coat off and his shirt sticking where the sweat had caught the dust. He had a pick on his shoulder and a shovel stuck in the earth like a flag. The old wellhead had been pried back. He had widened the circle and the soil fell away in clean cuts. "I did not ask for that," Willa said. "You said the water tasted like nails," he said. He did not look up. He lifted the pick and brought it down, not fast, not furious, just steady. The sound traveled through the handle into the ground and into the bones of the cabin. "You need clean water." Willa watched him in the gray of that hour, when the sun has not decided how to light a place. His back worked under the thin shirt. His hands, careful at the rifle, took a different care in the dirt. She felt something like tired hope and did not let it show. She went inside and filled a tin cup from the spring bucket and brought it out to him. The lip of the well had always been a little sandy where the edge gave. She stepped close to set the cup on the flat of a stone. Her boot found a pocket where the soil had loosened. It slipped. Her weight went forward toward the hollow. The breath came up in her throat and stuck. Arms closed around her ribs and the weight of her stopped moving. There was a different weight instead. She hit cloth and heat and the air knocked out of her, but not from falling. Cass pulled her back with all of himself. Her cheek found his chest a heartbeat. The pick fell and cut the dirt close enough to make a new line. She heard his breath at her temple. He smelled like iron and earth. "You all right?" he asked. He had his hands open now, not holding but near enough that if she pitched again he would catch what needed catching. She nodded once. It made her throat tight. "Set it by the stone," she said, and her voice sounded normal. She set the cup and turned away and did not run. He went back to the pit. He worked until the light lay down across the yard and the shadow of the cabin reached the fence. Then he stopped and wiped the shovel blade with a rag as if it were a thing that would rust if he did not treat it like a thing that mattered. He put the wellhead back for the night. He did not knock. He walked past Cinder and Cinder did not growl. He picked up his coat and left. The weather broke wrong 2 days later. Afternoon had been heavy. Heat pressed at the back of the neck and made the air taste like it was brewed. A black line built in the west. By the time Willa saw what it meant, rain was already running in ropes across the slope. She went out without the sense to think. She had covered young corn with burlap before, and she tried again, fingers working knots with speed that forgot skin. Water rose over the tops of her boots. It found every seam of her clothes and went inside. She set a rock on a corner and the wind took it anyway. She set another and the burlap fought back, The storm spoke, and she argued in whispers with it, and never once raised her voice as if shouting would let it know where to hit her. By night she was shivering, and could not get the matches to strike. She sat with her back to the stove on the floor, and ordered her hands to do what they would not do. It took a long time for the flame to catch, and another long time for the water in the pot to show any sign of thinking about heat. She slept without meaning to on the floor, her head against the wood, the ledger on the peg looking across at her as if it could keep watch. Cass found the door set, but not latched. The yard was full of the smell of wet dust and split wood. He stepped inside and called her name once. She did not answer. He crossed to the corner where the pallet lay. Her face was all she had not covered. He knelt and put the back of his fingers to her cheek, then to her forehead. Heat stood there like a man in a doorway. He stood up and set the kettle right and added wood. He found the tin of willow bark and the dried mint near the window. He wrapped a scarf around her neck and tucked the ends like an old woman would. He set a stool by the stove and sat with his legs planted and his hands ready to hold whatever needed holding. When she coughed, he lifted her and let her lean into him and got the basin in place. When she slept, he put the basin close to where her hand could find it without looking. He spooned oats into her mouth while she floated somewhere without ground. He did not talk to her like a prayer or like a command. He just spoke plain in the room about the fire, about the kettle that would not stop singing, about how Cinder had decided the hearth was a decent place and had set his head on his paws again. Near midnight, the fever climbed. She muttered names into the dark and words about posts set straight and a fence line that did not hold the way she wanted. He wiped her face with a cloth and counted breaths, not because counting would change anything, but because counting would keep his hands from shaking. He shifted the chair and took her hand so it would feel a weight that was not pain. His thumb rested along the edge of her palm. He did not press. She woke before the light came. Her eyes wrinkled as if she had smelled smoke, then cleared. She looked at him in the crooked chair, his head bowed, his hand around hers, his boots still on. The scarf had loosened, and he had tucked it without thinking, and that was the kind of thing she saw and did not say out loud. "You can let go," she whispered. "I can," he said, and for a moment he did not. Then he did, and put her hand back on the blanket, and stood and put more wood on the fire like it was the first thing he had wanted to do all along. By morning her skin cooled. She sat up slow, and the world stayed where it was supposed to stay. Cass stood by the stove stirring a pot, and the smell of oats and a little salt filled the place and made it feel larger. He turned and saw her eyes open, and some line in his face eased. "You are awake."
I am.
He brought the bowl, and she ate, leaning against the wall. He waited while she swallowed each spoon. He looked at the window when she looked at him, as if windows were useful for that. After she stood and moved to the table and set 2 plates and cracked 2 eggs into a pan and set out jam she had put up in the last good summer. They ate without ceremony and took turns with the butter. At one point he reached for it and said her name in a way that did not feel like a test. "Willa." She looked up. He seemed surprised that he had said it. He did not take the word back. "Thank you," he said, and left it where it could be whatever it needed to be. The day found its own pace. He mended a hinge in the yard. She pruned the pear tree and felt the sap under the thin bark shift to meet spring. Cinder slept. The cabin moved its little sounds around them in a steady circle and did not make anything large of it. Late afternoon brought a rider with a coil of ribbon pinned to his jacket. He handed over a stiff card with printing along the top and a smudge of orange jam on one corner, where someone else had not been careful. Harvest supper at Hale Barn. The date sat polite and fixed in ink. The boy did not look at Cass. He looked at Willa and nodded because the person with the card had to nod at someone. Near evening, Cass came to the step with a soft gray shawl folded across his arm. He stood on the ground. He did not put his boot on the first board. The light had turned honey and made the dust in the air look like it could be tasted. He held the shawl the way a man holds a truth he cannot dress up. "I am not asking you to decorate a room," he said. She wiped her hands on her skirt. The card lay on the table inside with the date shining like a coin in a dish. The room behind her held the warmth they had made. The yard held the well that was not yet deep enough. The sky held its color like a held breath. "Stand with me," he said. She looked at the shawl. She did not reach yet. She took the shawl. The wool raised a prickle along her wrists. She did not thank him. She hooked the door with 2 fingers and drew it closed behind her. Cass turned for his horse without touching the threshold. Hale Barn glowed like a lantern set on the land. Lanterns hung from rafters. Fiddle and banjo traded lines in a corner. Laughter broke and stitched itself back together. The long tables had pies lined up like a parade, and kettles so wide a man could have bathed in them. Men had slicked their hair. Women had pinned ribbons. Children slid in socks across swept boards and were chased back by a woman with a cloth in her hand, who could not stop smiling while she scolded. Cass walked Willa in beside him. He did not touch her back. He moved like a banked fire, steady and present. Heads turned, some lifted in greeting, some slanted to look. The talk rose again as if what they carried could not be held down by a pair of boots crossing a threshold. Willa kept her chin level. Her dress was plain blue with the hem still dusty from her yard. She had not scraped her boots. She had washed her hands, and the lye had made them dry and pale at the knuckles. The shawl lay soft over her shoulders and held a little of Cass's cologne, clean and faint like pine and iron. Cass, an older rancher, said, touching 2 fingers to his brow. He gave Willa a small smile that did not ask anything from her. Near the pie table, Violet Kincaid drifted forward as if pulled by sweet smoke. Lace curled at her throat. Her eyes went bright the way glass can go bright when the light hits it wrong. Well, she said, a wife made of paper has a different shine up close. Willa's fingers found the edge of the shawl and pressed there so she could feel the fabric give. She kept her mouth quiet. Cass slid his hand into hers in a way that did not ask permission and did not pretend they were anything other than what they were. He spoke for the room as much as for Violet. She is my wife, he said. He did not raise his voice. It carried anyway, and that is the easiest truth I live. Violet held her smile until it cracked at one corner. She said something about pies needing checking and went where pies could answer her. Willa looked at Cass. He did not look down. He watched the far wall for a breath. Then he looked at her and his hand loosened and he let go. He did not ask if she wanted to dance. They danced after someone put a hand on Willa's shoulder and asked because the tune had slowed, and it would have been hard not to. She nodded because saying no would have made more of a thing than it deserved. Cass put his palm against her shoulder blade. Her other hand found his sleeve. They moved like people who knew how to carry weight and had not practiced carrying it together. He counted in his head without letting it reach his mouth. She followed the count she could feel at his wrist. They found a step that did not trip them and stayed with it. For a moment the room eased off and the smell of apples and smoke and sweat sharpened and everything else dimmed. They did not dance a second time. They stood near the edge of the room where the air moved and watched the way people leaned toward and away from one another. Willa could feel eyes on her and let them be eyes. Cass stood without blocking anyone's path. He looked like a man watching weather. After a while she went to wash her hands because the pie filling had stuck to a spoon and to her thumb, and it was a good excuse to stand alone for a minute. A side room held a wash basin and a stack of folded cloths. The housekeeper had left her mark in the way the fabrics nested corners at corners. A shelf along the far wall carried ledgers and a tin stamped with a law firm's name, Barlow and Sons Butte. The lid had a dent that matched a man's habit of pressing his thumb there when he opened it. Willa's eyes touched the name and moved on. She dried her hands and came back into the warm. Later, when she stepped outside to breathe air that had not been through other lungs, the night felt close and kind. The stars held their places over the black rim of the barn roof. Cass followed after a minute. He leaned a shoulder into the post and did not crowd her. You did not have to say it like that, she said. I know. They stood until the cold sent them back in. When they were ready to leave, he took his hat from its peg and held the door so it would not slap the frame when they passed. He lifted her into the saddle with his hands around her waist and set her weight where the leather would take it. He did not linger. They rode back in a quiet that felt more than empty. At her step, she slid down and landed hard because she had not been paying attention. The boards rang. He caught her elbow without thinking. She did not pull away. She drew breath and let it out slow and went inside with the shawl loose over her arms. He did not follow. He stood with his hand on the top rail the way he had that first day and waited to be told what to do with the night. Nothing told him. He put his hand down and went home. Morning put a clear light on everything. Willa set bread to rise, then took her father's ledger from the peg to record what she had planted late. The steward paper lay folded where she had tucked it. The edges had picked up the ghost of soot from the old pages. When she lifted the steward paper free, another sheet came with it tucked to its backside as if the two had been put to bed together. The second page was thinner onion skin, and the ink had bled a little like it had been in a damp drawer. At the top, the Barlow letterhead sat neat and proud. Draft settlement. The date read 2 weeks before Judge Pritchard had called her name. The language was clean and exact. Suggested union to secure retention of Hart's Draw within Hale Holdings. No obligation to cohabit. Dissolution without penalty after harvest cycle. Purpose strictly legal. She read it twice and did not blink. The room made a small sound that had nothing to do with the stove or the wind. It came from inside her own chest, and it was like a hinge giving way. She put the paper on the table and put both hands on either side of it because the edges looked like they might bite. Outside, Cinder scratched once and settled. The day went on being the day. A fly butted a window and forgot and tried again. Willa folded the paper along its crease and then unfolded it. The crease held. She lifted the steward document and set it aside. She took the draft and walked to the door. She did not put on her shawl. She did not take the time to pin her hair tighter. She crossed the yard in boots that had not had time to dry by the stove. Cass was near the barn at Hale Range, speaking to a hand about a wagon tongue that had split under a load of wet hay. He listened to a description of the break and looked at the wood as if it were a kind of truth that could be sanded and pinned. When he finished, he turned and saw her. She did not step close. She did not stand far. She reached into her coat and took out the paper and threw it so the heir had to make a choice about which way to move it. It hit the dust near his boots and slid and stopped at his toe. He bent and picked it up. His eyes went to the top of the page and then to the date. They paused there before they moved again. He read the first line. He did not hurry. He folded the paper, then unfolded it carefully, like you might handle something that had already torn once. "How long have you known?" he asked. His voice had no heat in it. "Since a minute ago," she said. "How long have you?" "Barlow put that together before we knew if Judge Pritchard would bother with improvement, in case we needed to move fast." "In case," she said. The word sat flat on her tongue. "That is not what this is now." She let that pass through the air and fall somewhere she could not see. "You should have told me there was ever a version where I was a tool." "You would not have said yes," he said. "No." They stood without cover in the clean light. A wind came from the ridge and rattled the aspen leaves near the creek. The sound was a kind of teeth. Cass did not reach for her. He did not cross the line of the dust his boots had made. She did not soften anything with a look. "You made sure the roof got fixed," she said. "You dug at the well. You fed me when I could not lift a spoon. And before all of that, you planned to use me like a fence post. I planned to get you your ground any way the law would let me. That is not the same as me." He looked at the draft again like words might be different if a man looked at them long enough. They were not. He folded the paper once. His hands were careful. He did not put it in his pocket. He held it. She turned and put her hand on the rail that marked the barnyard from the road. The wood was smooth from palms. She stepped over it and back into her own line. She walked away without asking him for anything, and without leaving anything behind that she would have to ask back for. Willa did not cry on the road back. The sky had that bright, hard look it gets when weather is thinking of turning. At the cabin, she hung her coat, pulled the trunk from under the bed, and lifted out the cotton dress she had worn to the mayor's desk. It still carried a wrinkle from where she had bent her elbow around the ledger. She took it outside, set it in the iron pan where she burned scraps, and struck a match. The flame caught slow, then quick. Cloth shrank and curled. Smoke crept into the eaves and sat there like a thought that would not move along. Cinder watched from the step with his chin on his paws. When the last thread turned dark, he made a small sound in his throat and went quiet again. She washed her hands in the basin until the cold bit. She set the ledger back on its peg and tried to make the room look like it had before any of this. It would not. She sat, then stood, then put the chair back where it had been the day her father measured the distance from the stove to the door and claimed it was good to have a clear path. Bootsteps came in the yard. Cass did not knock. He stopped and took his hat off and held it by the brim, as if that could help him decide something. Willa stood in the doorway with her hand on the jamb. He looked at the burned cloth in the pan and took that in without flinching. "I did not plan to hurt you," he said. "You did not plan to tell me either." He took a breath and set it down. "I do not want the version of us that fits on a draft." "There is no version," she said. "There is me and you and a paper you made before you knew my voice." He looked at the top step and nodded her face. "I will leave you be." He set something small on the second board, down from the threshold. It hit the wood with a sound like a coin. A key. He did not explain it. He put his hat back on and went. He did not turn. Late wind leaned into the walls as if the whole ridge had shifted. Willa stood until her knees ached. She did not pick up the key. She closed the door and slid the latch and sat on the floor with her back to it until the latch pressed a groove into her shoulder blade. She thought of the draft paper. She thought of a hand that had worked a pick calm as a clock in her yard. By morning, the air had the smell of iron. She could feel cold in the nails. Clouds crowded the ridge. She pulled on her shawl and filled a bag with what a person takes when a house is too loud to be inside. Bread end, dried apples, the small notebook that had fit in her father's vest pocket when he went to look at fences. She took the road up the blue alder path because old places know how to carry a person without asking questions. Snow started as a sift. It thickened fast. Willa reached the hunting shack her father had patched years ago when the roof was still good. The roof would not be called good now. It would be called holding. She pushed the door and felt the give of swollen wood. The hinges complained. Inside smelled of mouse and sap and old smoke. She set her bag down, found the kindling her father had left tucked under the bench, and built a small fire in the stone corner that did not pull like a proper chimney but would pull enough. She wrapped herself in a blanket that had been left behind by a man who had once sworn he was allergic to wool. She laughed once and it sounded like a cough. She warmed her hands and held them open to the flame until the heat bit too. She took out the small notebook and opened to a page where her father had drawn a pear tree in 3 lines and written in a hand that had never learned to be fine. Willa holds a hammer straight. She set her thumb to the words and felt the dent. Snow stepped in heavier. It scuffed at the door. Wind came like a stranger trying the handle and then trying it again. A seam between the logs said something in a thin voice. Willa pulled the blanket up and slid down the wall until the boards met her back more surely. She slept and woke and slept again and lost the thread of time that shacks tend to steal when no clock is there to argue. At hail range, the men came in stamping and laughing about how the season had turned them fools. Cass listened and did not smile. He poured coffee he did not drink and set the cup down hard enough to splash. He saddled a horse with his hands moving like they were remembering a drill. He rode to Hart's Draw and found the gate hanging open because the latch had iced and the rope had not held. He found the cabin empty and the firebox cold and the key still on the step with frost in its grooves like sugar. He saw the line of a track that had been a boot path and was now a white smear. He picked it up where a person would have put their weight to climb. He let the horse take its own pace when the ground told it to slow. Snow thickened until it felt like rain that had lost its courage. The horse blew and lowered its head. Cass spoke to it in a voice he had used on skittish stock and on wounded calves, a voice that understood work. The blue alder shack showed itself in the way smoke tries to leave a place that does not want to let it out. The roofline was a kick against the ridge. He slid off and left the reins looped. He took the step in 2 strides and pushed the door. It resisted, then gave. Warmth slid over his hands from the coals, thin but honest. Willa looked up. Her face held that gray fever look from a night that had not gone well. Her eyes were already clear. She held the blanket close around her and did not move. "You should not be here," she said. "And you should not be up here alone in a storm." He stood in the doorway and let the snow choose what part of him it wanted to melt on. He waited. She did not tell him to go. He stepped in and closed the door with a hand on the latch so the wind would not take it back. He set his coat on the floorboards where a body could sit without giving heat to the stone. He did not go to her. He went to the fire and laid on 2 splits and blew until the coals woke and the flame took. He found the iron hook and hung the small pot from it and poured water from his canteen, because the bucket in the corner held only ice. He put a pinch of tea in the water and watched it cloud brown in a way that looked like health. He put his gloves by the hearth and felt his fingers without them the ache and the return of feeling and did not complain out loud. Willa watched him work like a man who had been a stranger and had learned a few of her rooms. He moved with care. He kept his boots on the place where the floor held best. He checked the crack alongside the window and stuffed a rag there without commentary. He found a knot of rope by the door and untied it and retied it with a bowline that would not give if a person pulled hard. He did not look at her after he set the rope right. He looked at the window again, like it asked something from him. "I did not come to talk you around," he said, eyes on the steam that had started to rise. "I came because storms lie and make a person think they only need themselves." She let that sit a long time. The tea steamed and made a small ring of wet on the soot above the pot. Cinder came to the threshold, looked in, and decided the fire was worth his bones. He circled once and set his chin on his paws near Willa's foot. Cass pretended the dog had chosen the spot on his own. He poured a little tea into a tin cup and set it on the floor within Willa's reach, and then he moved away again so she would not feel the reach was a transaction. She took the cup with both hands and held it for the heat before she tried a sip. It tasted faint and good. "I wanted it to be clean," she said, and her voice surprised her with its softness. "Not the paper, the U.S." He sat with his back to the door and put his palms on his knees. It can be what we do now. I do not know how to forgive a plan that was made before you knew me. I do not ask you to forgive a plan, he said. I ask to stay until the wind drops. The shack settled. The storm measured the walls and rubbed along the roof. Willa breathed slow, then steady. She put the cup down empty. He took it and cleaned it with a twist of cloth and set it where it would dry. He stretched out on his coat, not close, not far, the way a man sleeps near a person who may want space. The fire lowered itself to a bed of ember. Cinder lifted his head once, then let it fall. At some point, night turned into that thin hour before day. Cass woke with a start that did not show. His arm had crossed the space between and lay over her blanket like a thing that did not belong to him. He did not move fast. He drew his hand back and set it on his chest and stared at the seam where roof met wall until his breath remembered how. Willa's eyes were open. She had been awake before him. She looked at his hand where it had been and at his face where it was now. Light found them in pieces through the cracks. Snow outside had set the world to a hush. The cold was sharp and clean. She turned on her side and looked at him, and the words came like a thing that had been waiting under a rock for the right hand to lift it. I do not want the land anymore. He watched her mouth form the shape of what she meant. Snow whispered on the roof and let the quiet hold what she had given. I want what grows on it, she said, with you. He nodded, not a grand nod, a steady one, the kind a man uses when he sets a post straight. They set the coals so they would not die too fast. They wrapped the pot so ice would not claim it. They stepped into a morning that had been brushed clean. Snow came to their knees in spots and left their boots squeaking. The horse blew steam and tossed his head. Cass set Willa on the saddle and led them down through the blue alder and the black rock and the bend where wind forgets itself for a breath. By noon, the valley showed its dark earth through the melt. Heart's Draw waited with the door still shut and the key still glittering frost in its grooves. Willa picked it up and turned it in her fingers until the cold lost its bite. She set it in Cass's palm and closed his hand with both of hers. His breath snagged once. He tucked the key where a man keeps what he will not misplace. The cabin smelled of old heat and wet wool. They built a new fire and dried their coats and poured water into a cup to see if it would steam. It did. Cinder took the hearth like it had been left for him, spine to the stone paws, crossed one ear at attention. Willa moved through the room and touched what would come with her and what would not. She lifted a quilt and folded it tight. She ran a hand along the shelf where her father had kept nails in a tin. She held the tin a long time, then set it beside the ledger. They did not say the word move. They began. That evening, Willa carried a small box to Hale Range and set it on the table by the kitchen window where early light would find it. The next day she brought a jar of wild plum preserves and the spoon with the notch her mother had made by stirring in the same spot for years. She hung her shawl by the door beside his coat and did not check if the hooks were even. The day after, she leaned her spade in the corner near his saddle. The tools made their own kind of prayer when they clicked together. Cass did not change the way he stepped through a doorway. He paused at thresholds and waited for the room to answer him. The rooms answered. Willa tested the wellhead with her palm and felt the new depth like a heartbeat. They set the bucket and listened to the line hum as it dropped. When the bucket struck, the sound came back right, not hollow. Cass pulled hand over hand. The rope burned and then found the hard spots in his skin where it could not bite. Water rose cool and clear. Willa dipped her fingers and tasted iron gone quiet. She smiled without showing teeth. In the barn, she retied the gate the way she liked it tied. She stood with the rope loose in her hands and thought of all the knots a person learns because someone told them that was how it was done. She made a bowline and set the loop where it would not pinch anything that tried to pass. She tugged hard. It held. Cass watched from the other side and said nothing because it needed nothing said. Evening stacked itself neatly. Stoves talked and went to coals. The yard settled to the sound of stock-shifting weight. Cass wiped his hands on a cloth and walked to the mantel. Above it, a small wooden box waited where he had put it after he worked the last of the daylight into the field. He took it down like you take down a book you know by heart. Willa sat with a pear in her palm and a knife in her other hand and did not move when he crossed. He knelt because standing would have felt like talking over her. He opened the box. The ring inside had been a silver dollar once. A file had thinned it, and a hammer had taught it to bend. It was not perfect. It held the marks of the hands that had convinced it to be a circle. I asked before with papers, he said. This time I ask with everything that has happened in this house and out of it." She set the pair down. She gave him her hand without making it ceremonial. He slid the ring to the place where it belonged and found that it did not scrape. It settled. She leaned her forehead to his and closed her eyes and let the world soften its edges. No one spoke. The fire answered for them with a quiet pop. The season turned with work rather than trumpets. Willa rose into the fields like she had been born to walk rows, not just watch them. She called to hands and was answered in the quick pitch of people who respect clear plans. She checked grain with a bite and felt the kernels crack right. She squinted into wind and did not slow. Her voice carried over wagon creaks and horse breath and the chuff of grain going into the mouth of a sack. From the fence, Cass lifted a small boy with a calm that said this was his favorite work. The child gripped a finger in a fist that did not understand letting go yet. He had Willa's quiet mouth. He had the shade of Cass's eyes. He wore a cap too big for him and pulled it down when the sun found him. Cass told him the names of things as if naming would help him hold them. Rowan Hart Hale, he said to the air and to the boy and to himself a name that would stand. People called across the rows because they needed decisions and jokes and someone to hear them cuss when a wheel hit a rut. They called Mrs. Hale without the old edge in it. Willa did not correct them. The words set in her ear and found a place that fit. She loosened a scarf and laughed at something a hand said and pointed with 2 fingers at a stack that needed shifting. The men moved it. The stack sat right and pleased her, and that was enough reward for the whole hour. At noon, the well paid out its clear weight again. A bucket rose and the rim chimed against stone. The sound went through the yard like a bell. Willa held a dipper and drank and let the cold make her teeth hurt. She passed the dipper to Cass. He drank slower. The boy reached and tapped the cup twice and laughed at the hollow sound. Cinder took a spot under the trough where drips fell at a pace he approved. Night folded in without hurry. The barn lanterns made their steady halos. In the house they ate cornbread and stew and let silence do the grace. When the dishes were done and the floor had the crumbs swept toward a pan, they climbed out the window to the low porch roof and sat with their backs to cedar. The fields went pale gold in the last of the light and then went to silver. Crickets took their shifts. The boy slept on a folded quilt inside with a hand by his head. Willa set her shoulder to Cass and felt the line of him wear into her like a groove a carpenter means to make. The ring found a place near his arm and rested there. Her hands smelled of grain and soap. His smelled of leather and the faint bite of the forge he had used when he bent silver. She spoke into the night like it would keep the words without taking them anywhere. "I asked you to let me keep my home." He turned his palm up on the roof between them and let her set her hand there. He looked out at the rows where the wind drew its fingers and set the heads of the grain to nodding. "You built it here," he said, touching his chest. He let his hand stay long enough that the heat of it sank into where it had rested. The wind let go of the eaves. Cinder sighed. A night bird lifted out of the cottonwood and went to the creek. The house held them without asking for explanation. The key sat on its hook by the door. The knot at the barn gate kept its shape. The well kept its promise and would not run bitter. They sat until the roof cooled. They climbed back through the window and closed it with care so the latch would not chatter. The floor knew their weight and gave back the same small groan it had given in the morning. In the cradle, the boy stirred and settled. The fire ticked as it changed from flame to coal. The land outside had its fences and its papers. Inside, they had a room that belonged to choice. They stayed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.